Deep in the belly of a mega foundry in the Rust Belt, 200 tons of molten steel were being held back by a single ceramic line pressure valve. It was a billion-dollar operation where the temperature hit 3,000 degrees, a place where any human mistake means instant evaporation. But a microscopic thermal leak had begun to melt the valve's control wiring from the inside out, turning the furnace into a pressure cooker seconds away from a volcanic breach. The Foundry state-of-the-art infrared cameras were blinded by the ambient heat, but Ember, a stray ginger cat with a torn ear, could see the thermal current shifting through the air. This is the story of how a 6-pound animal navigated a maze of liquid fire to stop a disaster that would have leveled a city block. Title: The Thermal Ghost, the Sentinel of the Forge. Chapter 1: The Molten Pulse. The Vulcan 7 Foundry was a cathedral of fire and industry, a sprawling complex in the heart of the Rust Belt where the air itself seemed to vibrate with a lethal, low-frequency hum. At its center sat the cauldron, a massive, ceramic-lined furnace holding 200 tons of molten steel at a constant, blinding 3,000 degrees. To the engineers who walked the gantries in their silver, heat-reflective suits, the facility was a mastered environment, a place where the primal power of the Earth had been tamed by silicon and software. They believed they were safe because every millisecond of the operation was governed by an AI that could detect a temperature shift in a heartbeat. But at 2:14 a.m., the impossible occurred in the darkness of the subfloor. A microscopic fracture, no wider than a human hair, had formed in the primary pressure valve's ceramic shielding. Through this tiny wound, a finger of superheated plasma began to leak, not into the open air, but into the internal wiring harness of the valve's control system. It was a silent, internal melt, a thermal short that didn't create smoke or flames. Instead, it was slowly liquefying the very sensors meant to detect a breach, effectively blinding the AI to the disaster brewing inside. The AI, receiving corrupted data from the melting wires, reported that the internal pressure was perfectly stable, even as the steel was beginning to eat through the valve's final safety seals. The Foundry state-of-the-art infrared cameras, designed to spot hot spots from a distance, were useless. They were overwhelmed by the ambient heat noise of the 2,000-degree floor. To the technology, the Vulcan 7 was in perfect health, but to the physics of the furnace, the building was becoming a pressurized bomb of liquid iron. If the valve failed, 200 tons of molten steel would erupt with the force of a volcanic mountain, vaporizing everything within a 500-foot radius. The resulting steam explosion would level the city block and release a cloud of toxic particulates that would poison the surrounding neighborhood for miles. The 50 workers on the night shift were essentially walking on a crust of thin ice over a lake of fire, oblivious to the fact that the all-clear green lights on their monitors were a digital lie. The only witness to this pending extinction was Ember, a 6-pound ginger cat with a torn ear and a coat the color of a dying coal. Ember wasn't a pet. He was a ghost of the forge, a stray who had survived for years by navigating the dark corners of the foundry where no human dared to go. To the workers, he was a lucky charm, a primitive creature in a high-tech world. They had no idea that Ember possessed a sensory superpower that made their billion-dollar sensors look like toys. Chapter 2: The Infrared Eye. Cats possess a biological sensory ability that modern science is only beginning to map: atmospheric thermoreception. Through specialized nerve endings in their whiskers and the hypersensitive skin of their rhinarium nose, they can visualize heat as a physical texture in the air. To Ember, the Vulcan 7 wasn't just a hot building, it was a shifting landscape of thermal colors. While the human saw only the white-hot glow of the furnace, Ember could see the invisible eddies of rising heat as if they were swirling ribbons of smoke. As the internal leak worsened, the air near the primary valve began to shimmer with a frequency Ember had never felt before. To his whiskers, the air felt sharp, a sensation of extreme pressure that triggered a primal alarm in his feline brain. He stood on a high-tension cable, his back arching and his fur bristling as he watched a plume of invisible heat begin to pool near the ceiling. He wasn't seeing light, he was feeling the molecular agitation of the nitrogen and oxygen molecules as they were superheated by the failing valve. In the control booth, the lead foreman, Elias, sat staring at a wall of screens. He felt a slight bead of sweat on his forehead, but he dismissed it as a failure of the HVAC system. "Check the coolant levels on the primary jacket," he told his assistant, never looking away from the steady green lines of the AI. Elias trusted the data because the data had never lied, but he failed to realize that the data was being generated by a computer that was currently melting into a puddle of copper and lead. Suddenly, a ginger blur streaked across the control room window. Ember wasn't just running, he was screaming, a guttural, yowling sound that echoed through the vibration-proof glass. He began to throw himself against the reinforced window, his claws scratching at the surface in a frantic attempt to get Elias's attention. To the engineers, it looked like the cat had gone forge crazy, a term they used for animals driven mad by the constant noise. But Ember wasn't mad, he was terrified of the blue heat he could feel building behind the steel walls. Ember dived back into the forge, heading straight for the danger zone. He navigated a maze of high-pressure steam pipes and glowing slag pits, his paws barely touching the floor as he sought the one thing that could stop the pulse. He was tracking the thermal signature of the failure, moving toward the manual bypass catwalk that hung directly over the liquid river of steel. He knew that the air here was lethal, one wrong breath of the 400-degree atmosphere would sear his lungs, but he moved with the suicidal focus of a hunter. Chapter 3: The Suicide Path. The manual emergency release was a relic of the old world, a heavy steel pin held in place by a spring-loaded lever. It was designed to be engaged by a human swinging a 10-pound sledgehammer, a final resort for when the electronics failed. To reach it, Ember had to cross a 20-foot span of unshielded steel grating that was glowing a dull red. The heat coming off the molten river below was so intense that the oil on his fur began to smoke, creating a faint mist of ginger and grey around his body. Every instinct in Ember's DNA told him to run for the cooling vents, but the pressure scream in his whiskers was now a physical pain. He could feel the valve's ceramic lining beginning to shatter, a sound like breaking glass that only he could hear over the roar of the burners. He reached the end of the catwalk, his paws blistered but his resolve unbroken. Above him sat the heavy steel pin, the only thing that could divert the 200 tons of steel into the emergency subterranean safety pits. Elias, watching from the gantry above, finally realized something was wrong. He saw Ember standing on the glowing grate, his body silhouetted against the white-hot light of the furnace. "What is that cat doing?" Elias shouted over the radio, his voice cracking with a sudden, intuitive fear. He looked down at his own hand and saw that the hair on his arms was standing straight up, the sign of a massive electrostatic charge. The air was ionizing. The breach was seconds away. Elias began to run toward the catwalk, but the heat was a wall that pushed him back. He was wearing a standard suit, not a proximity shell, and the air near the furnace was now 500 degrees. He watched in horror as Ember began to climb the red-hot pipe leading to the release pin. The cat's movements were agonizingly slow, his muscles struggling against the thermal exhaustion, but he didn't stop. He reached the top of the lever, his golden eyes fixed on the metal pin that held back the apocalypse. The sound of the furnace changed, a low, deep thud that shook the very foundations of the building. It was the sound of the primary seal failing. A spray of white-hot sparks began to erupt from the valve's housing, melting the steel floor like it was wax. Elias screamed for his team to evacuate, but he couldn't take his eyes off the cat. Ember wasn't just sitting there, he was gathering his strength for a final, impossible leap. Chapter 4: The 60-second strike. Ember knew he only had one chance. The pin was jammed by the sheer pressure of the molten steel pushing against the valve. He needed to create a shock load, a sudden force that would overcome the friction and snap the pin. He climbed to a high-pressure steam vent 10 feet above the lever and looked down. The world below him was a swirling vortex of orange and white fire. He took a single, ragged breath of the superheated air and launched himself into the abyss. He hit the lever with the full momentum of his body, the impact sending a jolt through his small frame that should have broken his ribs. The lever groaned, moving. Only a fraction of an inch. The pin stayed in place. Elias, watching from the safety of the stairs, saw Ember fall to the catwalk, his body limp. "No!" Elias screamed, reaching for his radio to call the fire team. But then, he saw the ginger tail twitch. Ember wasn't finished. The cat scrambled back up the pipe, his movements now fueled by pure, survival-driven adrenaline. He reached the steam vent again, but this time, he didn't just jump. He used the high-pressure air of the vent to boost his leap, throwing himself downward like a living stone. He hit the lever a second time, and the sound of the impact was lost in the roar of the furnace. This time, the lever moved an inch, but the pin still refused to snap. The valve housing began to glow a translucent blue, a sign that the steel was about to atomize. Ember climbed the pipe for the third and final time. He was no longer a cat, he was a force of nature, a ginger ghost fighting the lightning. He leaped, his claws unsheathed and his body coiled like a spring. He hit the very tip of the lever, maximizing the mechanical leverage. With a sound like a rifle shot, the steel pin snapped in half. The emergency bypass engaged with a deafening hiss of hydraulics. The 200 tons of molten steel, which had been seconds from a catastrophic breach, were suddenly diverted into the subterranean safety maze. The pressure in the furnace dropped instantly. The thermal scream in the air vanished, replaced by the mechanical groan of a cooling machine. Ember fell to the catwalk, his fur singed and his ears blackened by the heat, just as the primary valve housing finally exploded into 1,000 harmless shards. Chapter 5, The Forge Debt. The explosion was contained within the safety pits, but the shockwave was enough to shatter the control room windows and throw Elias and his team to the floor. For a long minute, there was only the sound of falling glass and the crackle of cooling metal. Elias scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering in his throat. He didn't look at the monitors, he didn't check the pressure logs. He ran toward the high catwalk, his boots thumping on the scorched metal. He found Ember lying on the grate, his breathing shallow and his golden eyes closed. Elias scooped the cat into his arms, ignoring the heat still radiating from Ember's fur. He felt the faint, steady beat of a heart, the fastest, bravest heart in the Vulcan 7. He did it, Elias whispered to the workers who had gathered at the base of the furnace. He pulled the pin. The team stood in a stunned silence, looking at the tiny animal who had just saved their lives and their city. The data logs were retrieved later that morning by an independent safety commission. The graph was terrifying, the internal pressure had reached 99% of the hull's burst capacity. The manual bypass was engaged exactly 45 seconds before the primary housing would have atomized. The AI had remained green until the moment of the explosion. The report stated that without manual intervention by an unknown agent, the Vulcan 7 would have been the site of the deadliest industrial accident in the nation's history. Ember was rushed to a specialized veterinary trauma center, funded entirely by the Foundry's parent company. He was treated for thermal shock and respiratory distress, but his spirit was unbroken. Within a week, he was back on his feet, though his ginger fur was now flecked with forge gray and his torn ear was a little shorter. He was no longer a stray, he was a shareholder in the life of every person who worked in that building. The Vulcan 7 was officially renamed the Ember Forge in a ceremony attended by the governor and the families of the workers. A small, golden statue of a cat sitting on a lever was placed at the entrance to the control room. But the real tribute was in the hearts of the men and women who worked the night shift. They never looked at the all-clear green lights the same way again. They learned that the most advanced technology is still the one that walks on 4 paws and sees the heat before it turns into a flame. Chapter 6, The Living Failsafe. Today, the Ember Forge is the safest industrial facility in the world, not because they bought more computers, but because they changed their philosophy. They realized that the thermal ghost was a necessary part of the system. Ember was given a permanent security clearance and a specialized climate-controlled station built directly into the gantry. He is the only employee allowed to sleep on the job, provided he keeps his whiskers tuned to the frequency of the forge. Elias, now the plant manager, never starts a paw without checking on Ember first. He watches the cat's whiskers and the way he tilts his head. If Ember is calm, the steel is safe. If Ember's ears twitch, Elias orders a manual sensor sweep. They have created a biodigital partnership, a fusion of feline intuition and human engineering that has prevented 3 minor leaks in as many years. They proved that the future of industry isn't about replacing life, but about honoring its ancient, sensory wisdom. Ember still patrols the dark catwalks, a ginger shadow in a world of orange fire. He doesn't care about the medals or the name of the forge. He only cares about the thermal colors of the air and the steady hum of the machines. He knows that the fire is always hungry, and he knows that he is the only one who can hear it when it starts to growl. He is the sentinel, the ghost, and the guardian of the iron. As the sun sets over the industrial skyline, the lights of the Ember forge glow like a star on the horizon. Inside, 200 tons of steel are flowing smoothly, a river of light. That fuels the modern world. And high above the river, a ginger cat with a scarred ear sits on a silver pipe, his eyes glowing with the reflection of the heat. He is at peace, but he is always listening. Because some heroes don't need a voice, they just need to feel the world before it breaks. The legend of the thermal ghost has spread to every foundry from Tokyo to Berlin. It is a story told to every new apprentice on their first day: respect the heat, trust your gut, and always keep an eye on the cat. Ember's legacy is written in the steel that builds our cities and the safety of the people who melt it. He is the proof that even in an age of silicon, the most powerful tool we have is the ancient, unbreakable loyalty of a friend who sees the invisible fire. $1 billion AI said the furnace was safe. A stray cat said it was a bomb. If Ember hadn't taken that leap of faith, 200 tons of liquid steel would have erased the Vulcan 7. If you believe that animals see the dangers we miss, hit that like button and subscribe right now. The question of the day: does your pet have a favorite or weird spot in the house? They might be sensing a thermal leak or a hidden wire. Tell me your stories in the comments, I read every single one. Don't let Ember's bravery be extinguished. Click the notification bell and I'll see you in the next epic survival story.